Hello and welcome back to the Ralph Ellis Talks. And today we're going to talk about the star shafts, the so-called star shafts deep inside the Great Pyramid. Now, Orthodox Egyptology says that the shafts in the Great Pyramid are star pointers, and they point at the stars of Sirius and the belt of Orion. But this is incorrect, and I'm going to demonstrate to you that it is absolutely incorrect. So here are this is the standard star pointing theory. So we have the four shafts inside the Great Pyramid, which come out of the two main chambers in that pyramid. We have the Queen's chamber down below, and it has two shafts that point upwards and outwards from the pyramid. And then the King's chamber above it, and that again has two shafts which point out of the pyramid and seemingly up towards the heavens. But do they? Where did this theory come from? Well, it came from the 1990s when we had a big flurry of theories about the Great Pyramids and the Giza Plateau. And the first of these, I suppose, that most people will remember, was Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. And he based a lot of his information upon Hamlet's Mill by Santillana and Duchend, I think he's called. And these books explained that the ancients understood precession and the precession of the equinox. And in explanation, well, I don't want to spend too long on this because we've already been through this in previous talks and lectures. But in brief, the Earth is like a gyroscope and it precesses. So this is a gyroscope and you can see it precessing on its axis. And the Earth does exactly the same. So here's another little GIF, and this is of the Earth, and you will see that eventually it too precesses, it circles around, and the axis of the Earth moves in relation to the northern stars and constellations. So currently we're pointing at Polaris, but we didn't always point at Polaris. The axis of the Earth actually pointed at different stars in the northern constellations. And this is important because you can date ages via precession. So normally we do this by looking towards the east, and we will see the constellations change every few thousand years. And if you associate your monarch or your civilization or your monument to a particular constellation, to Taurus, to Aries, to Pisces, or perhaps even Leo, you can date that monarchy or that monument. And the most obvious processional marker in Egypt is perhaps the Sphinx, and you've probably heard of this. The Sphinx is an image of a lion, and it points due east, which is where we do this processional dating, looking at itself across the horizon. So here is the Sphinx now looking towards the horizon, towards itself, rising at the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. And it does so on a particular date. And the date for Leo rising at the vernal equinox is 10,500 BC up to 8,000 BC. It's quite a large constellation, and we don't know if Leo is supposed to be looking at the beginning of Leo or the middle or perhaps the end of Leo, and that's why we get this range of dates. So let's say it was supposed to be pointing at the middle of Leo. That would be about 9,250 BC, a long, long time ago. This is the whole debate about the age, not only of the Sphinx, of course, but of the Giza Plateau and the pyramids. So let's presume that this is the date for the Sphinx and for the founding of the Giza Plateau and for the building of the pyramids. So that makes them about 11 or 12,500 years old. But what of the shafts, the star shafts inside the Great Pyramid? Well, these were originally called air shafts, but two of these shafts are not even cut through to the outside. So they were definitely not air shafts. And then they were called, I don't know what you call them, soul shafts maybe, for the souls of the departed pharaoh to exit the pyramid up towards the heavens. But no other tomb in Egypt has these shafts. No pharaoh has ever been found in a pyramid. The pyramids were not tombs, they were temples. They were temples mainly to the cosmos. They were not tombs. And again, two of the shafts were not even cut through to the outside. So it's unlikely that these were shafts for the souls to exit the pyramid up towards the cosmos. Then along came the book, The Orion Mystery, written by Adrian Gilbert and some other unimportant co-author. And this said that the shafts point at the stars of Orion and Sirius, because the three pyramids at Giza mirror the belt of Orion, and therefore these shafts were pointing up towards Orion. You've probably all seen this diagram, even in some quite serious reference books, and they will all show this particular star pointing diagram. And this sort of became important because you can use this star pointing to derive a processional date for the Great Pyramid, for the construction of the Great Pyramid. And that turns out to be 2480 BC, which is slap bang in the middle of what some Egyptologists were saying for Giza. And so classical Egyptologists jumped upon this because it confirmed their fairy tale chronology about Egyptian history. And that's why we see this particular diagram repeated in almost every reference book. But it is wrong. It's very wrong. So let's look at this neat little diagram. It looks like the shafts are actually pointing at the stars, but this alignment does not occur at the spring equinox, which is when we normally do this processional dating. The king's south shaft points at Orion at midnight on the November the 9th in that particular era when we're looking at 2500 BC. And the queen's south shaft points at nothing at midnight. You have to wait another 40 minutes until 1240 for the queen's shaft to point at the star Sirius. And the northern stars don't really point at anything. I mean, they're supposed to point at Polaris and various other stars around the northern constellations, but they're 2 to 4 degrees off, so they're not really pointing at anything. So you can see the problem here. You can choose any date for this, for this sighting. You can choose any time, and you can point at any star. There is no reference point. It's not like Leo, which is, the Sphinx, which is looking at Leo. That is a particular reference point, and it gives a particular date. The only correlation with the star pointing hypothesis is that Giza sort of represents the belt of Orion, and therefore maybe we're looking at the stars in Orion. But that's the only correlation. It is not quite such a neat star pointing theory as is made out. And it's doubly wrong because in reality these shafts, the small shafts inside the Great Pyramid, are mathematical. Well, so let's go through this. Great Pyramid is a pi pyramid. You probably know this, but a lot of people still don't fully understand that these pyramids were mathematical. And the Great Pyramid is a pi pyramid. It was based upon the pi fractional of 22/7. So here is a small pyramid measuring 7 units high and 44 units around the base. And next to it is a small circle, which again measures 7 units in radius and 44 units around the base. So these are the sort of dimensions of the Great Pyramid. So the Great Pyramid is, in essence, it's a representation of a circle. That's its basic design. It was based upon pi. It was based upon the formula for a circle. It does represent a mathematical constant of pi. And all they've done to create the pyramid is they've multiplied this very, very simple circle and triangle. They've multiplied it by 40. So if we multiply by 40, we get the following diagram. So on the left, you see the small triangle. You multiply by 40, and you get the size of the Great Pyramid. It's 280 cubits high and 1,760 cubits around the base. Those are the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. To the nearest, I don't know, 4 centimeters or so, it is extremely accurate. So the entire pyramid is based upon the pi fractional of 22/7. But the small shafts are also based upon 22/7. They're based upon pi. So if we look at the angles of these small shafts, they are as follows. The king's shaft is 39.5 degrees and 45 degrees. And the queen's shafts are 39.5 degrees and 32.5 degrees. So the difference between these shafts angles is 5.5 degrees and 7 degrees. 5.5/7, which is a quarter of pi. Pi is 22/7, and here we have 5.5/7. We have a quarter of pi. So it looks like the shaft angles, so looking back here at the shaft angles are based upon pi. And the trouble is, a pi shaft cannot point at a particular star on a particular date. You need some sort of flexibility in this system, in the angles of the shafts, to point at your chosen star on a chosen date. And a mathematical shaft that is based on pi has no flexibility whatsoever. It just points. And it doesn't point at a particular star or a particular date. So the star shaft theory is false. It's been debunked. The book, The Orion Mystery, is a load of rubbish. It doesn't make any sense. And also, I mean, it never made any sense in the first place. The star shaft theory gives a huge lacuna in the chronology of Egypt. It's saying that the Giza Plateau and the Sphinx were built in 10,500 BC, roughly, as we've already seen. And now we see that the Great Pyramid was not built until about 2,500 BC. So there's an 8,000-year difference here. The Egyptians were sitting there for 8,000 years with the Great Pyramid, with the Giza Plateau all laid out ready, but they didn't build the pyramid for another 8,000 years. They were sitting there looking at their watches, or rather looking at their sundials, waiting for the right date in order to build the Great Pyramid. It just does not make sense. If the Giza Plateau is circa 10,000 BC, then the Great Pyramid should also be circa 10,000 BC, especially as the pyramid uses the same building technology as the base that it sits on, the Giza Plateau. The leveling of the plateau, I don't know if you've been there, but if you go and have a look, you'll see that the leveling of the plateau was as great a feat as building the pyramids, because they had to level the site by creating an artificial platform. And it's all built with huge megalithic blocks. It's using the same building technology as the Great Pyramid and using the it was the same construction project as the Great Pyramid. That's quite obvious when you go there. So there shouldn't be this huge, great 8,000-year gap between the building of the plateau and the building of the pyramid. It just makes no sense. So what were these shafts? Well, we know they were important because they were so difficult to make. And here is one of those shafts. This is an image of the King South shaft, I think. And it just looks like a sloping hole within the structure of the Great Pyramid. But that's not really so. If you look at this diagram, you'll see that the shafts were made of sloping blocks that conform to the angle of the shaft itself. And they were surrounded and abutted by horizontal blocks that formed the actual pyramid. So this shaft was a series of sloping blocks that went through the horizontal blocks of the core of the pyramid. Simple. Well, actually not so, because if you build it like that, there is nothing to stop all of these sloping blocks from just slipping straight back down through the center of the pyramid and into the chamber down the bottom. And you would end up with a pile of rubble in the chamber. So what they had to do was they had to put girdle blocks around the shaft to tie that shaft into the structure of the pyramid. So they put these huge great stones with the shaft going through the center of the stone, and that girdle stone would lock the shaft into the structure of the pyramid to stop all the stones just running straight back down through the pyramid and into the chamber. Very clever, but very difficult, very technical. And Rudolf Gantenbrink, who did a lot of the early work on these shafts, said that the shafts were so complex that they doubled the time to make the pyramid. And they're even more complex than they look on that diagram that I've shown previously, because they actually curve around the ascending passage while maintaining the same angle of trajectory out towards the surface of the pyramid. So they were very, very complex shafts to actually construct. And they were concealed. Two of the shafts were open and obvious, so you could go into the chamber and actually see these particular shafts. But the other two in the Queen's chamber were completely hidden. You had to search for them. So this appears to be a sort of riddle, a quest. And it took a long, long time. It took hundreds of years before Wayne and Dixon discovered them by pushing a piece of wire. They saw a small hole in the masonry, and they pushed a piece of wire through, and it kept on going and going and going, so they knew there was a void behind those particular stones. And so they chiseled out those stones and discovered the Queen's shafts. So they were concealed. This was a quest. You weren't supposed to easily find these particular shaft angles. So these shafts were important. But if they were not star shafts, then what were they? Well, getting a little bit esoteric, I have previously suggested that these shafts were probably representations of latitudes and longitudes. And while that might sound surprising, the ancients appear to have known the form of the earth, and there are many examples of that I have in my books. And they built geodetic monuments that represented something to do with the earth and its form and its shape and its size. And the Great Pyramid is one of those. For instance, the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile in circumference. And the nautical mile is based upon the circumference of the Earth. It's a terrestrial measurement system. And in some of the books, like Fingerprints of the Gods, you may have heard that the Great Pyramid is a 43,200th of the circumference of the Earth. But where does that number come from? I mean, it doesn't sound very meaningful, does it? It's not a 10,000th or a 100,000th or a millionth of the circumference of the Earth. So where do we get this strange figure from, 43,200? Well, it comes, actually, from the number of minutes around the equator of the Earth. So if we divide up the Earth for navigational purposes, which we've done for hundreds of years now, you'll see that the equator has 360 degrees. And it does so because the Earth takes about 360 days to go around the Sun. That's where our 360 degrees to the circle came from. It means that every day of the orbit of the Earth measures 1 degree as we travel around the Sun in our orbit. That's how we got our 360 degrees in a circle. But if you multiply that 360 degrees by 60 to derive the number of minutes, which is exactly what we do in measurement systems, we derive 21,600 minutes, or 21,600 miles. That's how the nautical mile was actually derived. It was derived from the form and shape of the Earth. Or, if we multiply by 2, we get 43,200 half-mile units. The same number that is used in the Great Pyramid itself. So the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile, and it is indeed based upon the circumference of the Earth. So that we know that the ancients had a good idea about the form and shape of the Earth, and a good idea that they understood longitudes and latitudes. And the interesting thing is that if we plot the shaft angles that we've already obtained as coordinates, they produce a cartographical triangle on the surface of the Earth. So if we do that, we see that the king shafts were 39.5 degrees and 45 degrees, and the queen shafts were 39.5 degrees and 32.5 degrees. And if we plot those on a map, we derive a triangle on our map which has the same dimensions as the Great Pyramid itself. And we see that here. We have a triangle which is, okay, the triangle is upside down, but we have a pyramid here that is 11 units along the base and 7 units high, which is exactly the same as the Great Pyramid itself. If you remember back to that diagram of the pyramid, the triangle, and the circle next door to each other, those were the dimensions of that particular triangle, 11 by 7. The pi numbers that form the size and shape of the Great Pyramid. And so this vast triangle now on the face of the Earth, if we place this map onto the Earth itself, has the same dimensions as the Great Pyramid. And now all you need to know is where this huge cartographical pyramid lies and what it actually means. And that is the big mystery of the Giza Plateau, that the ancients were not exactly playing a trick on us, but they were certainly devising a quest for us, a quest to see if we could understand the meaning of the Great Pyramid and what it pointed towards. So I hope you've enjoyed this short talk, and you can join us again next time. Thank you.